So now we come to Hausman's view. Hausman's view here, this is in a book, especially Preference, Value, Choice, and Welfare. It's much discussed. Daniel Hausman is an older gentleman, Professor Emeritus, Department of Philosophy at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He works in philosophy and methodology of economics, and he's the author of many books and articles. He is one of the best-known authors in the field. He's probably the most famous living one in philosophy of economics. Okay. Now, what I'm going to do is I present Hausman's view and Hausman's criticism, and something very useful Hausman does at the beginning of his book. He usefully distinguishes 4 different meanings of preference in English. And if you want to have clarity when you use in economics the term preference, you should know what you do not mean, but other people may mean by the term preference. So the first one is enjoyment comparison. If you say, I prefer this or that, then you may mean, I do enjoy this one more. Enjoyment comparison. That's, of course, a mental concept. This is what you feel then, your enjoyment. The second meaning of preference is favoring, giving something a better chance. So, for instance, affirmative action. Or you have it today, of course, we talked about it already. If you increase diversity, when you say so, my point of view now, this gremium must have more, whatever, blacks, female, whatever, bald people, or whatever your preference are. And then you say, so I put someone of that group, I put them in there, not because of competence, but because I want to push that to get this proportion of this kind of people in this gremium. And then it is something you don't enjoy, possibly you don't enjoy that, you don't, and not the other things, but you're just giving it a better chance, or him or her a better chance. So example is affirmative action in American universities concerning students or faculty, and that just means you favor people, some sort of, or some people, or some of the choices. Then the third is choice ranking, describing actual choices. That's also one meaning of preference. And this is, of course, what revealed preference theory says, right? Preferences just tell you choice rankings, period. Or preferences are choice rankings, period. And the fourth possible meaning is a comparative evaluation, when you judge something better as something else. So this is a variant of number 1, or more general than number 1. Number 1 is, of course, just a comparison with respect to enjoyment. And here in number 4, you judge something better as something else, and it's not yet clear what the basis of this better judging or judgment is. So these are 4 different things. Enjoyment comparison and favoring will not be part, or is not part, of economics. But number 3 is, of course, revealed preference theory, and we will see that number 4 is what Hausman favors in a specific variant, and I'm going to explain that to you. So that is very useful to have that in mind. I was about to say that is so useful that one may use it in a written examination, for instance, but I'm not promising anything. Okay, Hausman has a critical claim and a constructive claim, right? And these 2 claims I'm going to explain to you. Namely, the first is he claims that preferences in economics are not choice rankings, and thus revealed preference theory is inadequate for economics. This is what he claims. So he says what many economists say, that preferences are just choice rankings, revealed preference theory, and he says no, in this generality, this is false. This is Hausman's first claim. And the second claim is then he has an alternative to offer. He says preferences in economics are something else. They are complete subjective comparative evaluations. I'm going to explain these 4 terms. And it's not only that descriptively this is the case when you observe what economists are really doing. He says they are really using preferences in that sense, complete subjective comparative evaluations. And he also says, and this is good. This is a good practice of economists. This is how they can really do good economics, and you can't do that on the basis of revealed preference theory. That's his second claim. Okay? So he criticizes the traditional stuff and puts instead something else, and we'll look at that. And I explain that to you and give the arguments, and then later we'll even see a critique of Hausman's view, that you see, oh, that's also not quite clear whether it's right or not, although it may at first sight be very plausible. So, let us first look at Hausman's criticism of revealed preference theory. Now, the criticism is very clear, right on target. Preferences in economics are not choice rankings, what revealed preference theory says, and thus revealed preference theory is inadequate for economics. This is, of course, quite heavy, and most economists don't like things like that when philosophers say, yeah, I mean, what you do in your science here, that's just wrong, I'm sorry. And I know it better as a philosopher. So it's very rarely, very, very rare that scientists then, oh, thank you so much, dear philosopher, that you finally tell us the truth for which we were too stupid. No, that's usually not the case. Usually then scientists stop talking to these people. Anyway, so here are the two arguments. Let's look at the arguments and not do sociology or psychology. Now, the two arguments are the following, and they're not stupid arguments. They're quite good, and one has just to be clear how to counter them, possibly. Now, the first argument is if preferences were defined by choices alone, so you can only ascribe to someone a preferences once this person has chosen, made a choice, right? Then they would be undefined in situations without actual choice. Right? That's clear. I mean, if preference is just another expression for choices, then of course they wouldn't be defined if someone hasn't chosen at all. Right? Now, and that is indeed in economics the case, that your preferences are ascribed to agents in situations without actual choice, not only in predictions, but also in general. You set up a model, and here are the examples. For instance, if you ascribe to agents a preference for lower inflation, they never ever had the choice to choose lower inflation, right? It's not, they can't choose lower inflation. But still, you may ascribe in a certain model in which certain choices are made or certain things are compared. You may say, yeah, the agents prefer lower inflation for that and that reason, right? Because they don't lose their savings or whatever, all right? The preferences, or for instance, the preference for a higher salary in the same firm. This is something you may ascribe in a certain model to someone, but that's not the choice of someone. You may say when the agent changes the firm, then he chooses something, right? And then you may say, oh, why does he or she change the firm, quit the firm and go to another firm? Oh, yeah, because the salary is higher. Then that's a choice. But if you say that the person has a preference for a higher salary in the same firm, there is no choice. And then if you, in strict reading of revealed preference theory, the preference would be undefined. Or the same holds for ascribed preferences in game theory, right? You set up a game, and then you say, and then you describe what the preferences are, but there were no choices before, right? And the question is, how can you do that? So, well, whether these are really knockdown arguments, that's a very different question, but these are the arguments that you find in Hausman, right? I'm not going to discuss them in greater detail here, but go rather to the second argument. And that second argument seems to me a really very strong argument. Whether it can be counted is a different question. But this is the argument: one cannot derive preferences from choices because choices have a belief component. So you don't see that this is an argument, and I'll give you an example. Okay. So the idea is, if you look at the choices, you cannot conclude what the preferences are. Why? Because there's an additional component in the choice that's not in the preferences, right? And here's the example. Imagine there's a city with 2 restaurants, possibly even more, and we have Adam and Bill, and they choose, one evening, they choose restaurant X. And then the revealed preference theory at first sight, would say, of course, Adam's preferences, Adam's and Bill's preferences, X is preferred to Y because they choose it. Now the question is that really so? Now, it may be that Adam's preference is indeed X, so he prefers X for Y. But in fact, Bill's preference is Y. He prefers Y to X, but he erroneously believes that Y is closed, and therefore he chooses X. So you see these two agents, they both choose the same item, namely restaurant X, but one on the mistaken belief that the other alternative is not available, right? And there you see that a belief component enters the choices in addition somehow to the preferences, right? Because Bill would rather go to restaurant Y, but he doesn't choose it and goes with Adam in restaurant X because he thinks mistakenly that Y is closest. So in other words, if you look at these examples, then the conclusion is that choices do not necessarily reveal preferences. They only do if the agents have truthful and complete information about the available options. Right? Only if all actors and agents involved have truthful and complete information about the available options, then you can conclude from their actual choices what their preferences are. Right? So this is a presupposition that comes into, works its way into revealed preference theory, and without these presuppositions, revealed preference theory may give you wrong results. So you conclude then preferences from choices, and you will be wrong in predicting the next situation, right? The next choice of Bill will be in this, but if you conclude it, you will predict the next time he will, again, when choosing between X and Y, he will choose Y. But in the meantime, he was told, no, Y is open. No, then he will, of course, choose Y. So your prediction will be false because you concluded his preferences from his choice. And that doesn't work if there's a belief component. That is wrong involved in the choice. So this is an interesting point. Of course, it's not that the neoclassical economists are now completely defenseless, but this is one of the things that Hausman brought up in order to show that revealed preference theory is not okay. And last year in the class, I also discussed a paper here because I had also some years ago the idea that preferences are really dispositions to choices. They are not the same as choices. They are just you are disposed to choose such and such. And that seems to be really more reasonable. But if you read Gould and Pesendorfer, they say no. And others as well. They say no. Choice and preference is synonymous. They are saying that, right? I also think that's not even necessary to defend the neoclassical view. I think the best view is really, and there's another paper I think I haven't in the list, a recent paper, I think 2019 or 2020, where the author says, but also with a different background, the preferences are dispositions. I really think that's by far the best way, because when you say dispositions, disposition is, for instance, being soluble in water. So sugar has the disposition of being soluble in water. It is not solved in water, but if you put it in water, then it will solve. So this is a disposition for something. And it seems to me that the best way to articulate what preferences are, they are dispositions to choices. And the dispositions becomes actual or is realized under certain circumstances. Namely, if I put the agent in the choice situation and say, take A or B, go ahead, right? So, and the further advantage, I think, is that the term dispositions is completely neutral with respect to the questions, what are preferences really? Are they something mental, or are they something psychological, or whatever, or just behavior? Because a disposition, you can say, well, it's a mental disposition, or you can say it's a disposition to choice, to behavior. So the term disposition is completely neutral with respect to the different variants that you may have for your understanding of what preferences are. So it's ideal in that respect, and it does exactly that, what you say. Well, somehow here are the preferences, and they become actual in the choice situation. And the best term to use there is really dispositions. I've talked with quite a few economists and philosophers of economics before 2020, before this paper came out, and asked them, isn't that in the literature? Because it seems to me so plausible that preferences should be seen as dispositions. It wasn't in the literature, but this paper by Guala changed the situation. But he has a slightly different background. But anyway, so you are absolutely right. And I think the problem is, and it becomes, according to my understanding, really unproblematic to say that, because you're not taking side in this debate. What are preferences really? right? Because you say, yes, whatever they are, psychological, whatever, or mathematical, or whatever, but describing this as disposition is completely neutral with that respect. And that solves, I think, resolves certain of these problems. But the point is that some of these defenders of neoclassical theory, they are so pointed that they say, well, it's just choice, nothing else. And then they think if they open their mouth and say, let something else in, that they open the door for all kinds of bad influences. But I think that's not the case with the term dispositions. You don't open anything for mental ideas concerning that or choice. It is just completely open and neutral. Anyway, yeah, very good question. Thank you. All right. Now we come to Hausman's view of preferences. And according to Hausman, references are total, subjective, comparative evaluations of a set of choices. Now, I explain these terms that are here. A set of choices, that's quite traditional, the options available for the agent to choose from. So that's just the choice set, the set of choices. Now, comparative evaluation, that was number 4 on that list, on that earlier list, when I said it's just judging something better than something else. And it's not clear what the basis of this better judging is. It's just someone changes something better, such that in case of a choice, she or he would then choose that one, judging something better than something else. So that's comparative evaluation, right? Then subjective, the judgment as better is depending on the agent. Right? That means subjective. It's the agent who thinks this or that is better, and its basis is open, whatever it is. You know, whatever it is. Can be 1,000 different things. And finally, and that's the critical component here, total. The idea is that everything that is relevant to the agent is taken into consideration. So the agent chooses something, and then the idea is that in the preference and in the choice, everything that's relevant for the author, for the agent, for this choice is taken into consideration. Everything. So all the consequences, all the presuppositions, and everything. So the agent must be, well, really clever and considerate. You consider just everything. Well, as you really sometimes certainly do if you choose a partner with whom you want to have children with. So usually, well, most people, or reasonable people, usually think, well, there are many aspects, right? This is not just whether he's got nice hair and brown eyes. No, there may be other aspects also relevant. So, and oh, there's another aspect, and look at his parents, oh no, and his brother, and so on and so forth. And is he rich? And so on. And is she rich? So there are many, many aspects. And when you choose something, then you have to integrate all of that. And as you all have some sort of experience with life already, you know that not only in choosing partners, but also in other things. I mean, you go to University of Zurich. Why didn't you go anywhere else? Well, there are many aspects that come together. Anyway, so total, everything that's relevant to the agent is taken into consideration. That is all relevant properties and consequences of the choice, right? Choices have consequences, sometimes very, well, case of babies, yes. Takes you 20 years until they're out of the house anyway. Okay, so that's the view of Hausman. And of course, that would by only in passing, that's of course then a disposition to choose in a certain way. The total subjective comparative evaluation is of course a disposition to choose, because once you're in the choice situation, that's your evaluation. Here you go, and choose the one with the that you think is better. Okay. So such preferences have certain properties. And of course, in this particular case, in Hausman's view, preferences are mental states. So it's not just behavior, but it's something subjective, some psychological state or a mental state of someone before the choice, before she chooses then, whatever she prefers. Preferences are, unlike wishes, always comparative. That's a very important standard thing, which you should know if you talk to non-economists. Preferences are always comparative, wishes are not. Right? You may say, I wish I had a Ferrari, and if someone then asks you, do you really prefer the Ferrari for the Lamborghini? Then you may be helpless, say, oh, never thought of it, I'm sorry. Yeah. So it's not comparative, you wish, but preferences are always comparative. And that's, of course, standard everywhere. Preferences must fulfill the axioms of ordinal utility theory, otherwise you get all sort of problems and you can't use them. But I'm not going into detail. You find that in Hausman. But this is the important thing. The axioms place a high cognitive demand on the agents because they are complete, transitive, and context-independent rankings of alternatives. And they require balancing very different considerations. And this, this total evaluation means that everything, that's relevant here must be taken into account. And whenever you have a somewhat complicated choice, then you know how complicated it is because you have an aggregation, right, of all the different aspects. And they have different weights and pull in different directions, and it's highly complicated. It's rather easy sometimes if you choose, a piece of bread or a pretzel or so, then it may be easy, although some people take some time. All right. So, and preferences can be explained within economics. So it's not that the explanation and the causes of preferences are pushed into psychology. No, Hausman says, no, the explanation of preferences is also a part of economics. And I'm going to show you how he thinks that is a part of economics, and that's within this framework quite plausible. And the preferences determine choice. Why that? Because they incorporate everything that is relevant to the agent. That's the basic idea. That is something that in revealed preference theory is also there, mostly not explicitly articulated, but it's implicit there. Preferences determine choice, so everything is in there. Yeah, therefore there are no additional factors who determine the choice. So all the factors that's relevant for the choice are in the preference. And again, this would of course justify the idea that preferences are dispositions to choices, and they are just triggered by the choice situation. Okay, now with respect to this, everything is included. I had long periods of reading and trying to understand what Hausman means here. Really, his wording about the connection of preferences with choice is not entirely unequivocal. You may, if you read that text, sometimes he says total rankings determine choice. Sometimes he says preferences determine choices only in conjunction with beliefs, which would mean that the beliefs are not part of the preferences. So there are preferences plus belief. And sometimes he even says preferences determine choices when combined with beliefs and constraints. So he's not completely consistent there, the way he writes it. Now, I once wrote a comment there and sent it to a journal, and then he was one of my referees, and he answered that and was very unhappy about it. And then later he gave a Zoom conference on preferences here at the University of Zurich, September 21, how Hausman clarified what he means. And what he says, preferences determine choices under the following condition, given the knowledge about alternatives and no error about availability. And that's, of course, again, clear. Then, if there's no error involved, then, of course, the belief component doesn't play a role, because the belief only everything is true. So if you have the knowledge about the alternatives and no error, then preferences determine choices. The constraints enter via beliefs. So the constraints don't enter themselves, but only via beliefs. This is also unclear in his original article. And strictly speaking, he said, preferences refer to complete states of the world. So that means that the agent chooses between states of the world, namely one with chosen A and the other one with chosen B, with all the consequences they have. Right? So this is really demanding, and you don't even know what you're doing, right, when you choose something. So whether that's plausible, that's highly demanding. And the question, of course, then is, well, is that really true? I mean, is that really how economic choices are made? Is that a plausible concept? All right. Now, before I go to this critical part, I want to exemplify Hausman's view, because he's presented a model of choice in which he tells us how the different components that go into choices, into preferences and choices, how they work together. And he presents that as a standard model of choice in his book, and it's based on his concept of preferences. Again, preferences are total, subjective, comparative evaluations. And then, once you know that, then you can see how choices are made based on this concept. And I present here a slight modification of Hausman's model, because I think Hausman's model is at some points a little sloppy. In his answer to my criticism, he said in the referee report, well, what I'm doing is that's not the economist's model anymore, that I cannot judge, but I think it's absolutely necessary corrections. Anyway, because that's not so important, you have to get the general idea of Hausman's model with my little things there. And the following figure should be seen as a flow chart that connects different elements. And this is contrary to Hausman, who claims that the connections are mostly causal, and they are not. That's quite clear. I think there he's really wrong, and the other things are questions of interpretation. But I don't want to go into the details there, because what I want you to get is an impression how this model of preferences, these total subjective evaluations, how they work in an actual case. And I will exemplify that by holiday planning. I mean, you know that Easter is coming, and there will be 2 Mondays. There will be no philosophy of economics, which will make many of you completely depressive. And the only way to fight that is, of course, go into a holiday, right? And then you plan to go to a holiday, and the foreigners, they say, oh, okay, I go to the Swiss Alps, right, and do some wandering and so on, and wonderful. And others may say, I go to Egypt and go to the sea and have nice and sun. So, and then you may have a girlfriend, or you may have a boyfriend, or you may have a partner, to be more neutral, and then you talk to each other and say, yeah, where should we go, right? And then you try to figure out what your choice is. And this is how that works, according to this model. So the first thing what you need is you need a list of alternative actions, and these actions are believed to be physically feasible. So if you and your partner, you say, one says, okay, how about the Alps, right? And then mountaineering a little, and the other one says, yeah, but Egypt is also a choice. No one of you, I think, at least if you're a graduate student, will say, why don't we spend the 7 days on the moon, right? No one will bring that up, because everyone knows that's not feasible, right? So the list of alternatives is limited from the very beginning. And then you have a list of alternatives, and you may have these 2, Alps and Egypt, for instance. And of course, this list of alternatives is influenced by the factual constraints. For instance, the factual constraint that Elon Musk is very active in some things, but not active enough that he offers for students, travel to the moon during the Easter break, right, for a week or so. Only 5 days, anyway. So that's a factual constraint. So therefore, they come into there, and they will have another function later on. So from this list of alternative actions to be physically feasible, you come now that you must develop beliefs about the aspect of actions. So you start discussing, what's the political situations in Egypt today? Do I want to travel there? Or what's the visa situation? Or you may say, okay, traveling to the Alps, isn't that a little dangerous because of the snow and so on and so forth? So in order to prepare the decision, you must know details about the alternative. So you must develop beliefs about aspects of the actions, of the alternative actions. And the aspects of the actions are their immediate properties and their consequences. Right? You may say that if we now go to Egypt, the consequence is that if you're a socialist, well, the ruling class in Egypt, they will get all our money, and I don't want to have that as a consequence. So we rather go to Switzerland. There are many pure people, and they profit then in Graubünden from what we are spending on wine and Salzitz and whatever we do. Okay? So aspect of actions are the properties, the direct properties. So for instance, you use an airplane to go to Egypt, but you use the train going to Graubünden. And of course, these are properties of the action, and also the consequences. And also the consequences play a role, right? If you are politically conscious, many people do that when they choose their holiday destination. They think of the political destinations, whether that's ecologically, socially, is that acceptable or not. Other people don't think of that. Well, that's what is important for the actors. All right. So then what you also have to have is values, including moral values, because you want to evaluate, do I like this alternative, right? Do I like that going to Egypt, or do I like that going to to Graubünden, and these must now combine your values together with what you know about the actions, must be combined, and then you get preferences over the aspects of actions, right? Then you have, for instance, you have the means of transportation, and you evaluate that, and you may say, oh, flying to Egypt, oops, I don't like flying for whatever reason, ecological, moral, blah, 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 whatever, or because you just get dizzy when you're flying. Or you say, oh, the train, or someone else says, no, flying finally again, we can do it. So you must have preferences over the aspects of actions, and they are then, of course, given to you by your values, including your moral values. And then you get a list. You get all the aspects of actions that are relevant, and you evaluate them, and whether you like them or not. Far from the decision yet. Then you must, of course, have beliefs about external normative constraints. This is something that Hausman brought up in his text, but doesn't build into the model. But I think it's a very good and interesting point. Belief about external normative constraints. I mean the following by that. That takes care of, for instance, moral convictions of your partner, which you do not share but respect in your preferences. Right? So, for instance, your partner is a vegetarian. Right? And then you know that in Egypt it may be very hard to get vegetarian food. You're not a vegetarian. But then you say, because of your partner, you say, well, in that case we won't go to Egypt. That doesn't turn your preferences. Your preference is still there, but you say under this is a constraint, right? That constraint eliminates the one alternative, and therefore you take care of it. So these constraints eliminate certain options, and that's an interesting point that must be, of course, taken into account, and I take that into account like that. And then you get certain external normative, you get external constraints, they eliminate certain stuff, you have the preferences over aspects of action, and then if you aggregate that, if you're able to do that, and don't commit suicide because the choice is so difficult, then you develop total preferences over the alternative actions, right? Then you have taken into account what you want, and the ecological, financial, and whatnot, and social, and so on, and your partners, and so on, and so on, and so on, and on. And in the very best case, you would develop total preferences over these actions, and you decide, yes, we go to Bündnerland, for instance, or Egypt, whatever. Okay, here you go. And then the next step is that you choose. So you go to the travel agency or what, and try to realize that. And here I make a little pedantic distinction. It's the decision to initiate the action, right? You say, okay, let's plan and go there. You initiate the action. But then sometimes, if you have made a miscalculation, there may be factual constraints. For instance, that yesterday it turned out that Egypt doesn't give you any visa anymore. Right? Then you go there, you try to get to Egypt, and then comes the factual constraint, not the belief in a factual constraint. That's a very important difference that Hausman doesn't make. In fact, it's very important that the factual constraints first enter just as beliefs. You think there is a restriction, but then when it comes to the realization of the action, the initiation, that initiation may be leading to the action, you perform the choice, or the failure of the action attempt. He discusses that at another place, but that's very important. So it's two different things: initiating the action on the basis of beliefs about constraints, and the action of the constraints themselves on the possibility of the action. That's two different things. And at this point, the difference here between the choice and the performance of the action, that is possibly restricted by the factual constraints. All right. So that's the full model, and that needs some comments, which in Hausman himself, it's not very clear what he thinks about it, but I think it is pretty clear that also this improved model of choice, like Hausman's own model, is first and foremost a normative model. Right? How did I get to this model? Well, I told you a story, and a plausible story. Did I make any empirical investigation? No. I just, you made such choices, I made such choices, and it's just a just so story, but it's obvious that it's reasonable to do it this way. right? But it's not an empirical model. It doesn't tell you empirically how people behave. This is the subject matter of another discipline, in fact. It's empirical research on choices. It tells you how a person may deliberate in order to come to a rational decision regarding a particular choice. It's not an empirical theory. Yes, you look at, well, aspects of action is just a general term that I introduced here, and it means all the properties of the action, right? For instance, flying to Egypt, right? Or the consequence of flying to Egypt and being there, when you think about it, wait a minute, who is going to profit in this country from my money? And you may say, I want those people not to profit and other people to profit. So it's a consequence of your action. And what you're doing when you evaluate it, you look at all these different aspects, including the consequences, right? Those consequences that interest you. Some people may not be interested in the social consequences when they go to a holiday. Others will be. Others will look at other stuff, So there are many different viewpoints. That's the idea. It's just spelling out what aspects of actions are. It's the properties of the actions themselves, that you sit in the plane and you burn the kerosene, right? And the other is consequences of action that happen perhaps half a year later, right? Okay. So, but they are some people evaluate them. They are just part of the evaluation. Okay. So this model of choice is, first of all, a normative model. It tells you how a person may deliberate in order to come to a rational decision. The model is just sufficient for the rationality of a decision process. Possibly not necessary. You may do this reasoning process in a different order or with different aspects, but it's certainly something which tells you what is sufficient for the rationality of a decision process. And this is where the plausibility comes from, right? When you hear this model, you say, yeah, that's plausible. And somehow, sometimes I do something similar to that, looking at the aspects, evaluating them, aggregating them, finding a compromise, taking into account what my partner thinks. And here we go, and then we decide, right? So this looks quite plausible. It's of course not empirical. It's not an empirical investigation. That's something else. Whether actual choices by real people proceed in this way is an entirely different question that must be and is investigated empirically. And that's very important. One shouldn't, again, I hope you take this away from this class, distinguish the descriptive or empirical from the normative. And this is really normative, and the plausibility is really by this, you get the plausibility for the rationality of such a decision process. But this is certainly not clear that everyone behaves that way, right? And you have many situations, in fact, you can find where you do not behave that way, but you just decide out of, you've always did it that way. You don't think very much. Okay.